Welcome to the Enneagram Global Summit. I am so excited to share this session with you, the title of Enneagram for the People, and our speaker, who is Micky ScottBey Jones. I have been dreaming of bringing Micky ScottBey Jones onto this summit for about 3 years, and I feel honored and thrilled that she's here. She is known as the Justice Doula, a womanist contemplative nonviolence practitioner. She's a facilitator, movement chaplain, a consultant, and a certified Enneagram teacher who facilitates conferences, workshops, pilgrimages, and conversations. She uses an expansive narrative Enneagram-based approach for accompanying folks in more accessibility and applicable self-discovery and empathy building with one another. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I am so happy to be able to share with you and with everybody listening how I dream of and think of and teach the Enneagram.
Well, I've been dreaming to have you here to do just such a thing. And even in the way that, we talked about in your bio, there's so many inspiring, provocative, mind-expanding ways that you describe your work. So for instance, if we even talk about you being a womanist contemplative nonviolence practitioner, that's an expansive vision right there. Can you say a little bit about that?
Sure. My original training was in consumer and family sciences. So when I went to college straight out of high school, I had grown up in the YMCA and wanted to learn more about kind of that path of supporting families and children. And I had also been raised up in the YMCA as a teen leader, right? So this was a very important path for me. Interestingly enough, my other path was the music business. And I ended up doing a little bit of stuff in that, but that's a whole nother conversation. And then years later, 14 years later, in fact, I decided to go for theological education and did my theological training with Indigenous folks, mostly based in the US and Canada. Even though that I don't identify as an Indigenous person, I wanted to learn from the first peoples of Turtle Island of North America, but they allowed me in that program to bring my full self. And so I closely identified when I found out what womanist theology was, that there was a theology that could be rooted in who I am as a Black woman, and actually not ask me to somehow set that aside in order to think about things of the spirit and things of soul and things of the higher power and creator. I found home. And that's what womanist theology does. It says we are actually rooted in a place and in a history and in bodies, and that my body as a Black queer woman matters. And so that theology helped me understand all other theologies, and that everything we teach and what we know is based in the bodies that we have, that we inhabit, and is based in our place, the neighborhoods we grow up in, the places that we visit, the people that we know right next door and around the world. And so those things are all embodied in womanism and womanist theology. And so that, became a cornerstone for me. Also a contemplative, I see my spirituality as being one based in meditation and thought and sensing what's happening in my body, right? All of those mystic things that contemplatives tap into. So I found a home there as well. And then I come from that lineage of nonviolence practitioners of the Southern Freedom Movement, and people who have said that you will not take my dignity. That yes, sometimes violence gets things done. We have to admit that there are ways that violence allows things, to happen and to get done, but that there are ways that we can make social change, that allows us to hold the humanity of everyone, even the person who may be harming me, who may be doing me wrong. There is a way to keep all of our humanity forward. And so, and nonviolence is about that, but it's also about that deep soul force inside me that gives me the strength to do what is right and the strength to make social change. And so all of those things are part of my work as a whole, but also come into, I think, my Enneagram teaching, because I think all of the ways you've been trained, the lineages you come from, the people you come from, all of that impacts how you're going to present information, how you're going to process it yourself, and then be able to, pass that wisdom on to other people. And so I try to embrace all of who I am whenever I'm doing my Enneagram work.
And in doing that, Micky, you make a home, a place of welcome for everybody with all of their parts and all of their lineages and all of that transmission is coming across so strongly. These words are so healing and inspiring. And it strikes me that the womanist thing too, it's like the woman's body really goes through so much rhythming. There's all these rhythms that we go through. And with births and menstruation and menopause and saging and all of those kinds of things. And so is there also an element of it that feels like it includes the environment, it includes Mother Earth?
Oh, sure. There is a kind of a branch of womanism that is this idea of eco-womanism, right? And our connection to the world. And, womanism, the term actually was first coined by Alice Walker. And I've studied Alice a lot. I've met her a couple of times and actually been led in meditation by her. And she talks about when she, I know, it was amazing. When she was writing The Color Purple, which I've of course read and seen the movie and seen the musical, and it has changed my life over and over again. But she talked about having to actually move to a place where she could be in nature in order to write that book, that the characters would not come and visit her unless she was in a place where she could touch the ground, where she could sit under a tree, right? So there is a deep connection with the earth, with Mother Earth, when you are connecting to your body. And there is so much wisdom to be gained as well when we start to think about how we've treated the earth and how we treat certain people in the same ways, right? There are certain people it's okay to dump on. There are certain places of the earth it's okay to dump on, right? And what can we learn when we are actually taking all of that into account, instead of kind of acting like it's all renewable, it's all going to be there forever? No, our bodies are finite. The plants, animals, the earth is finite, and we have to care for it. We have to care for ourselves. And there's nothing wrong with caring for ourselves. And we have to care for the least of these, those who are usually not cared for. And that also helps us remember that we have to care for the spaces of the earth that we often forget, that are underground, that are not cared for, that are seen as ugly, that are seen as undesirable. Those are the places that are often the most rich in resource. There are entire worlds below the surface that we don't know, right? And so all of this is wrapped up together in a deep, life-giving spirituality if we will just access it.
That is so beautiful what you said about that. So much of the richness is in the unseen, buried sort of parts, which is really resonant with the Enneagram, right? It's like what we're not seeing about ourselves turns out to be our greatest goal. Then of course we're going to go there. And first, I just want to say you got to be led in meditation by Alice Walker. Wow. And I feel lucky to be in your presence that you got to do that. So what does it mean, a movement chaplain? That's also very inspiring there. And also, I noticed that you take people on pilgrimages. So as a chaplain, tell us what happens there.
Yeah. So movement chaplains, it's, just like there are chaplains in hospitals, schools, prisons, people that are attending to the spiritual, emotional, social needs of folks outside of the walls of churches or mosques or temples, right? Outside of these religious institutions, movement chaplains are doing the same thing, but in our social movement spaces, right? So our places of trying to make that social change. And so I knew this was a thing, that we had always had people who had done the care work, whether that's fixing a meal, sitting at the table and listening to the stories of young people coming in from protests, helping people process the trauma happening during confrontations with authorities, right? All of these things have always been done in our social movements, but largely unseen, largely unnamed, but we have a legacy there. And as I started to research that more, as someone who was just interested in that, this term of movement chaplain, this idea of actually having a way of identifying that and honoring that position, and even having a way of training people for it, all of that started to develop. And so myself and my team, we started trying to figure out if there was a there. Is this a thing? And so started gathering people in about 2016 to even discuss if this was really a thing. And then from there developed a training called the Daring Compassion Movement Chaplaincy Training. And through that, have been able to train hundreds of people in this idea of movement chaplaincy. And also I've been able to be at actions and protests and be with folks who were doing everything from marching to sitting and blocking doorways, to making posters, right, and really attending to the spiritual and emotional and relational needs of those folks as they do that work. And so that's what it's about for me, supporting people as they birth more love, justice, and shalom into the world. So it's very closely tied to my idea of my justice doula work. I am that support person, not necessarily the person who's going to be planning the protest or the march, but how do I support those people to stay in it for the long haul? And in some ways, pilgrimages are similar, in that I do think that getting another look at your own situation by actually pulling out of your situation, right? When you go on pilgrimage, you go somewhere else that you don't live, and you learn from the people, you learn from the places, the food, the experiences. All of those things help you essentially see things in a new way, have a fresh outlook on your own experience and your own neighborhood and world, because you see that some people live very differently from you. You see some people, hey, we share this thing and we share that thing. And so there's something mystical and something deeply spiritual about what happens to you when you are on that journey, because a pilgrimage is almost never about getting to the place. Yes, we pilgrimage to certain holy sites, but it's the process of getting there, and even returning home and telling the story that does something for you. And so that is a way of renewing yourself, which is part of taking care of yourself, which is why I think that they can be so powerful, and why, especially for those who are dedicated to social change, going on pilgrimage and coming home can be such a life-changing experience, but also a renewing experience, so that you can continue in the work that you're called to in the world.
Mm. So our basket is so full here already. That what's coming up is First of all, the intersection, we talk about intersectionality. There's the intersectionality of the kind of universal invitation of the Enneagram with outer work in the world, with movements of social justice and equity and righting injustice and all of that, and ecological sustainability. And then there's the thing of, there are these buried parts, the parts we don't see, that are often where the greatest gold and power lies, and how the Enneagram, might bring that forward. And how do we make that accessible to everyone, regardless of their various life journeys that they've been on. So as we go into these conversations, Micky, it might be wonderful for people to hear, because obviously you have cared about the quality of life for this planet and for people and yourself, and you've studied, you've discipled yourself, you've practiced a wide variety of things. Why the Enneagram? Why is the Enneagram potent for you in this work?
Yeah, so my Enneagram story, I think, is similar to a lot of people, but the Enneagram helped me learn to love myself in some very particular ways. I think that there were things that I thought maybe were wrong with me, or, why do I act this way? And so the way it helped me develop my self-compassion was, in some ways, life-saving, and have been helpful during some of my most difficult times, even in times where people have essentially tried to weaponize the Enneagram against me. I have been able to go back to what I know, and go deeper in my learning, and realize that there's another way to understand myself. And I think the other thing is that the Enneagram, and for me in particular, the way I approach the Enneagram with this idea of Enneagram for the people, I don't think that spirituality has to be complicated. Even though it's mystical and many layered, and there's so many ways that we can do that inner work, that doesn't mean it has to be complicated. And I don't think it has to be inside baseball, right? It doesn't have to be all these terms and words and like things that are super difficult and only make sense to a few people. And so I think the Enneagram, because it's so, especially the Enneagram of personality, right, is essentially so young, we get to shape it. We get to be a part of how it continues to expand out into the world. And that's a really exciting thing, particularly in a time where a lot of people are jaded, we are skeptical of spiritual things and spiritual teachers, as we should be. To have something that we can be co-creators in is exciting.
So let's pick up on that, about how it's young, the Enneagram of personality, certainly the Enneagram that speaks to presence and, just pure being, awakening, developing our deepest gifts is ancient. But understanding it from the psychological perspective, and bringing that into the spiritual journey is quite young. And I love that you just made the call that we get to shape it right now. So one of the things of shaping it, and I think this is a challenge with many young movements, is not being willing to look at their shadows. And I just want to acknowledge the courage of you saying something that I'm sure many other people have experienced, that the Enneagram, like anything else, can be weaponized, and what I know this conversation is about is how to bring the power of the Enneagram into accessibility for everyone. So maybe can you speak a little bit about, how we, use the orientation that you have of maybe not making it so dependent upon particular words and concepts, but using the thrust of it, not using it in weaponizing ways. And then, like literally begin the conversation of how can we make it more accessible to everyone?
Mhm. Yeah. So there's this R&B supergroup called Lucy Pearl, and they only had a few hits, but one song that's kind of, I don't know, I guess a B-side, like not as well known, is called "Let's Do It for the People." And the lyrics say, "What do you know? Let's do it for the people." And I think in the future, because right now I'm not really out there having Enneagram workshops, but one day when we're back in person, I think that's going to be like my background music in the morning when we like come in, get everybody going. But basically, it's saying, "What do you know for the sake of the people?" Right? Like, it's not. I don't really care what you know unless it can actually help people. Like, show me how to get down with it. And that's what I'm thinking about when I'm thinking Enneagram for the people, is like, how do we actually make it something that the people can access? And there there are just so many people, I think, who come to the Enneagram, and there feels like an immediate barrier, right? Like, my equivalent is like when I talk to people who know a lot about astrology. They are just like, "Oh, well, an Aries is like this, and we just came off this retrograde," and I have no idea what they're talking about. Like, I know a little bit more now, but I have no idea what the words mean and what, all these things. And everybody else in the conversation is like, "Oh yeah," I'm laughing about it. And I think we can forget, once we're into the Enneagram, how it feels to be that person. Right. And so in an overall sense, I want us to somehow be able to bring people into the Enneagram and to talk about it in ways that don't, we're always going to have that to an extent, right? Because once you know a lot about something, you just know it and you're going to talk about it in that way. But are there ways that we can make it more accessible, that we can make it more applicable to people's lives? That the illumination, the light that shines on it, can be a light that's not blinding, but is helpful and actually shows us the path before us. And so, accessible is one of those words that we're throwing around a lot right now, right? Is it accessible? Is it accessible? And there are so many pieces of accessibility that we need to talk about. Now, my definition of accessibility is very much, I think, rooted in watching my mother in her job when I was a little girl. My mom was a director of disabled student services at UT Knoxville. And so I spent a lot of time in her office. As a little kid, you go to your mom's office and you hang out. And back then, I remember playing on a typewriter. So this was probably in the 80s. And her job was to make sure that people got what they needed in order to participate in the community of that campus and in their academic pursuits. That was what she needed to do. Now, whether you were on crutches for 2 weeks because you sprained your ankle, or whether you needed an interpreter with you all of the time because you were deaf, or whatever it was, her job was to make sure that you had what you needed in order to be successful in that environment. And I saw everyone who came in that office be treated as if they belonged at UT. It wasn't a question of whether they belonged. It was just about, let's make sure that you can get what you need. Let's make sure that let's make sure that your belonging is secured, because you have everything that you need to be able to survive and thrive in this environment. And so I think that was my first real understanding of what accessibility is. I didn't understand what it meant to like secure an interpreter or make sure you have captions on a webinar or whatever, right? The practicalities of how that happens and in what realm that happens is continuing to evolve for me, right? Because now I understand accessibility isn't just for disabilities. There are definitely things we need to be thinking about disability wise, whether we're in person or whether we're online. If you're hosting, workshops for people, can people get in the building, right? Like that's a question for accessibility. And also, what other kinds of barriers are there? Are there financial barriers, right? How is this the way that we present and teach the Enneagram? Has it been tied up with needing to have a particular amount of financial resources? Are your courses all taught in churches, right? What kind of barrier does that present to people that it is in a church building? Whether they're of another religion or an atheist or have church wounding, right? Like, so there are just things that we need to be thinking about in order to actually reduce those barriers to becoming to those who are becoming acquainted with the Enneagram, those who are trying to learn more, those who may not even know that it's a thing that can be available to them. But those are all the kinds of questions I hope that we can ask ourselves as teachers, as community of those studying together, and of those who want to become teachers, who want to to widen this out for everybody. No matter who you are, there is someone that maybe you don't know what their barriers are, and we have to figure out how can I make it more accessible to them.
So that kind of brings us to another word, applicable. How do we, with all the people, for all the people, how do we make the Enneagram more applicable to their lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we get into some of the real talk that can be difficult to have. That the Enneagram in the United States, which is my context, and largely the Western world, has been part of this kind of self-help / wellness / spiritual woo-woo kind of new age guru-driven industrial complex, right? This like yoga, wellness, self-improvement machine. And, many of us know this narrative of how the Enneagram of personality kind of came to the US through like these secret groups in Berkeley, and then through these monks, and right. And like, it has a very particular lineage in the United States. I don't know as much about how it has developed, around the rest of the world, and I'm excited to learn those things. But in the North American context, those are kind of our strongest lineages, and so that has kind of led to the Enneagram developing in those same paths. White, elite, spiritual seeker based, often affluent communities who have the time and the space and the luxury of spending hours and hours and dollars in this self-discovery quest. And also the path of white Christian communities doing spiritual based work. And so what that's meant is that there are people who don't fit in those communities, or who just aren't part of those communities, who haven't had the access, and who see the Enneagram as associated with those particular people and wonder, is any of this for me? Like, how do I apply this to my life if the only people who are taking these classes, or the majority of people, or the teachers, are all, white elite men mostly, a few women, but like, how can this even apply to my life if this is who it's for? If I have to have 5 hours a day to study it, or I have to go to California and spend a week in and spend all that money and whatever to actually learn this spiritual path, right? So, it's one of those things where we have to actually identify that. Like, we actually have to do that observational work that we learn as part of moving beyond just learning our numbers, right? We get into that contemplative work of being able to make those observations, and realize that who teaches something matters, that the lineage matters, and that when someone like me, a Black queer woman who, yes, has some privileges, right? Because I've been in these spaces, but also has these places of deep systemic and historic oppression. When I see something that has primarily been taught by people who I, have very little in common with, kind of historically and currently, and has benefited from those differences, I wonder if this is really for me. And I was interviewed for an article a long time ago called, and the writer, who is a white man, titled it, "The Enneagram is not just for white people." And every so often this article resurfaces and people get mad, mostly white men get mad at me. And I'm like, I didn't even write it. Like, he interviewed me and used my work, which is fine. That was the permission, right? But people get mad at me. And I'm like, well, like, why are you mad? And it's because, like, it infers that that some people think the Enneagram has just been for white people. And that's true, because the experience has been the only place to learn about it. The only teachers are people who don't seem to share my experience. And so what questions do we need to ask about that? To me, it doesn't mean the Enneagram's bad or useless or doesn't apply to my life. But it means that I have had to do the work of figuring out how it applies to my life. And of figuring out how to parse the wisdom of the Enneagram and kind of the sources or the teachers. Not that I can't learn from anybody anywhere, because of course I can. I have had teachers and mentors who don't share my life experience 100%. And I'm very grateful for that teaching. But I think that people are rightfully asking, if something is only taught by those with the most power, the most access, the most systemic supports, how applicable is it to people, that may not have those things at the same level? And so I think any Enneagram teaching that's applicable just means that it applies to their lives and relationships and work and love, and journeys of those who are encountering it. Like, is it so esoteric that a working mother or overwhelmed college student, can't find anything there for them? Like, in the Black church, we say, are you so heavenly minded that you're of no earthly good? And right. So is that what we're dealing with here? No, it has to actually impact people in their lives now, not just like, oh, I'm going to float away from my life and I'll escape my life. No. How does it actually bring goodness into your life now? And so I think that these are just some of the things we can start to ask ourselves, our practices that we use with the Enneagram, our materials. We're talking a lot about trauma now. Are all of our practices that we're doing, are we requiring people to close their eyes, which can trigger a trauma response? Right. And so we're not actually presenting something that's applicable to someone who has a lot of trauma. And so while it might be nice for them to learn their number, now you've taught them practices that require them to get quiet and still and cause more trauma to them. Right. So there are a lot of things we can be thinking about here. I'm not just talking about race or gender or socioeconomic status. There are a lot of things, which is overwhelming. Yes. But we don't have to solve it all in one day either. We have time, we have community that we can start having these conversations in and talk to one another.
Yeah. I mean, first of all, Micky, thank you for speaking these truths into the field. Because every one of us that has encountered the Enneagram has had and really let it penetrate us and help us unmask the ways that we are getting in our own way, has had the same feeling like, why doesn't the whole world know about this? And you are actually speaking to some of the reasons that the whole world does not know about it. There are other reasons too, and they have to do with things like academic grounding and, just professionalism and all of that. All of those things are being asked about too, but this is huge, what you're talking about. And you made an important distinction, I thought, that anybody could understand, which is that there are, whether you're talking about race or gender or sexual orientation or political, affiliation or neurodivergence or, physical challenges or whatever it may be, religion, trauma. There is the experience of those who did not have to work to see how the Enneagram is applicable to them, and those who have to work to see how the Enneagram is applicable to them. That is a searing game changer of a question. And I think that we do need to ask ourselves that in terms of Enneagram for the people, which is what it was meant to be always. And I'm wondering if you have any, like in this, you talked about the fact, well, I have two questions for you. One is, it has been tragic, there's no doubt about it, to be in a conference of several hundred people and look around and see it's a sea of white, beautiful white folks, and there's maybe here and there. That's been extremely tragic and something that a lot of us are working to change. One question that I have for you is, does it mean that people of color, for instance, have not been using the Enneagram? Or does it mean that they're using it in secret, in a sense, through books and videos? Or does it mean they're gathering together without us? And the second thing that you mentioned was about, who are the teachers? Yes, they have been predominantly white and male. And yes, as a female, absolutely, I understand. I have had to work harder, I would say that. And in this summit, humble attempt to correct that, I've made sure that if we're teaching a type, it's not just white, it's like we're inviting the teachers who are of color, who are of neurodivergence, who are of different things to teach in an intersectional way, not just to talk about, what you and I are talking about. So I'd like, those are my two questions to you. It's like, are the people of color still doing the Enneagram in secret or, on videos or doing it together or not? And secondly, are you hopeful about more people of color and other kinds of traditionally marginalized communities being included in the teaching?
Yeah, I'll try to remember both those. You might have to help me. The answer to the first question is, I don't know that we know. I do think what's most likely is that because of, again, like I said, kind of the lineages and how it came to North America and then how it's kind of proliferated out, I do think we have less communities of color in North America studying it. Now, I don't know what, because there's the South American connection to the Enneagram and to our teachers. So I don't know what it's like there, but, even South American countries have hierarchies based on skin color and race because they were also impacted by colonialism. So I don't, want to infer that the teachings there have necessarily reached more people of color, because I from what I can see, it looks like there has been some kind of stratification there as well, right? Because those same countries have a similar history to the U.S. and Canada. But what I will say is, because I think it has come through those two main routes, kind of that elitist Berkeley world and the Christian, white Christian world, we have not had as many people of color, Indigenous people, Black folks, that are teaching and or studying the Enneagram. I think that is changing, and changing pretty rapidly, but we do not know. To my knowledge, there are no one's tracking it, right? Like, even IEA, International Enneagram Association, while they have memberships and they ask you some questions, they don't ask race, they don't ask gender, they don't ask, so I don't know if they know who is certified and accredited, or I mean, they know who, but they don't necessarily know race, gender, ethnicity, country of origin, those kinds of things, right? So we can't solve a problem we don't actually have any data on, that we don't know. So as long as we just keep not talking about it, it's actually, we're not going to know. Now, are some organizations who train folks or and like just offer teaching, are they keeping those stats? I also don't know that. And so if they're not asking that question, they also don't know. My experience, my N of 1, which isn't always the most accurate, is that in recent years, I have met more people of color, more queer folks who are both studying the Enneagram personally and are also becoming certified and teaching and that kind of thing, and writing books about it. So I think there has been a shift, but it's still, I think, a very, very small shift. I don't know of a Black church that teaches Enneagram classes, right? Whereas I could probably find 5 in a matter of like seconds who teach, white churches who teach the Enneagram, like in my local area. I could probably drive to 5 churches who have Enneagram classes that are white denominations, historically white denominations. So I think that's part of it. But the world is changing and expanding, right? It's getting smaller and bigger. You have Instagram and Facebook and Twitter. And so people are finding each other and are finding things they could never find before. And so that's where there's a difference, right? You throw up an Instagram account and you're talking about Instagram as a Black woman, and boom, you have a following, right? So it's changing because of some of the technology we have. And then I would say, as far as the teachers, what was the question specifically about teachers?
Well, just like, for instance, on this summit, really have tried to have a design where we're not just having, for instance, people of color on to talk about those issues,
Right.
actually be part of the teaching of the Enneagram.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you're seeing more of that in general, or if we still have a long way to go.
Well, I think we still have a long way to go, but I think one of the things that has happened with the pandemic, and not to say that, yay for the pandemic, because it has brought a lot of pain and heartache and hardship, but it has essentially forced some accessibility. Allowing more people are doing trainings online, when before, I saw both organizations and like IEA essentially insisting that you had to be in person, right? Like, you have to do these trainings in person. You just won't get the same thing if it's online. Mm-hmm. And the reality is, for disabled people who, for whatever reason, cannot travel, they are homebound, people who are chronically sick or chronically ill that need to be able to lay down or sit down, for people for whom the added expense, it's not just paying for the training. You have to go for a week somewhere far away. You have your plane ticket, you have your ground transportation, you have where you're going to stay, your food, everything. And while being, a person of color doesn't automatically mean you're poor, we can easily look at the statistics of wealth in America and see that there is a difference in household wealth between racial groups. Like, it's a thing, we know it. With women, even with queer folks, often there is a difference in kind of economic status depending on who they are. It's not universal amongst queerness, but so these are all realities that have made becoming certified or getting any kind of training as a teacher less available to certain groups of people. And with everything going online, because now it was either it's online or it stops, that has increased some people's ability to participate. And then that also changed kind of IEA's stance on how you can be accredited, right? Like, what counts for that, your points. And so that's even changed, right? So I hope that we keep these accessibility measures, because I think, yes, people want to get back together in person, and that is important. And what would it look like to have a world where people could still be, involved, could still attend the same trainings online at the same time? We have a hybrid model, right, that allows for that thing, because you shouldn't not be able to be certified as an Enneagram teacher because you're homebound. There are still homebound people can still teach the Enneagram, right? And so we need to make that accessible. Somebody who can afford maybe the amount for the training, but it would be doubled or tripled if they have to then travel to it, should still be able to be an Enneagram teacher. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really important for us to somehow address these things so that it will start to allow people who have traditionally been shut out for various reasons. That even gets into age and status, right? If you have children, small children at home, you can't get a babysitter for a week, right? So all of these things are so important if we actually want to diversify who's teaching, if we actually want to start creating more lineage where it's going to be, oh, I was trained by this Black woman and this Black trans man and this Black whatever. Like, you have a lineage because we actually started it in 2021 because our trainings were more accessible and more affordable. And now we have that lineage in 20 or 30 years. But that's the only way we're going to get there, is if we stay committed to things that actually keep this open to more people.
Well, let this be a watershed moment, Micky, that you named it into existence, that 2021 is the beginning of some new lineages, Black, people of color, maybe more of a womanist approach, more of the feminine included, ableism, even the elders that have been so marginalized in American culture, who may have so much more wisdom to share when they hear about the Enneagram. And so for the final question, and I wish, let me use this as an opening to therefore say to people, for instance, we do know that there's a wonderful church that's run by Reverend Nian. She's on this, she's Vietnamese origin, indigenous. She runs a beautiful intersectional kind of church, and she is on the summit. And we do know about Tyler Sitt, also, a wonderful intersectional minister who started New Growth City Church in Minneapolis, just literally minutes away from where George Floyd took his last breath. So he's been in the thick of it, who's also Asian American. So they're already on the summit, and we of course have, but if there are Black ministers out there please, contact us. Let us know, because let's start growing this movement and this lineage. And Micky, I'd like to ask you for our final question. How can we, speaking of all of that and liberation, what can we do? How can we use the Enneagram to illuminate our lives in ways that are liberating, life-giving, and address the current concerns of the world?
Mm-hmm. So I like alliteration. So when I, talk about Enneagram for the people, I had to put illuminating, even though I know it's illuminating, right? You just got to give me this one because I needed them to all be A's. So, I think sometimes the way people come in contact with the Enneagram, they will talk about how when they first learned about the Enneagram, that they realized what their number was or what was true for them about the Enneagram because they felt so terrible about themselves. And every time I hear that, my heart just breaks a little bit. And I'm just like, oh, I hate that that's how it made you feel. And I think of it as like, that is the light of the Enneagram coming at you like an oncoming train, coming at you like one of those bright searchlights, and you're like, oh no, can't take it, right? Sure, some people need to have their ego taken down a notch. They need to have their spiritual inner work just be blasted onto them. But many of us need a light that will be gentle, that will show us the path, that will open up the path before us. But that is kind of like, like when the light comes in the window in the morning and it wakes you up, but it's like you wake up a little bit more each moment, right? It's kind of gentle and natural and it feels good. And so that's where I think it's actually for the people if it's that kind of illuminating light. If it's that gentle, clear, natural, illuminating light, not a floodlight. Because there are many of us who, for whatever reason, sometimes it's based in the oppressions that we face or the systemic kind of difficulties that are placed upon us. Whether that's because of our gender or race or whatever we're dealing with, where we are constantly being shown how we're not good enough, how we don't meet what the cultural expectations are, right? What the standards are of the overarching culture. And so we don't need a giant floodlight telling us what's bad about us. We need to deal with our flaws and the things that we do wrong and the bad choices we make. And we need a light that will shine on us and show us what is good about us, what is beautiful, what our superpowers are. And the Enneagram does give us all of that. It gives us the beautiful things about ourselves that we may not have identified because they've been buried, because we've been told they're not good. Somebody, we often talk about, different types of eights. And I think about this with women all the time, and they're like, but I thought it was bad to be assertive. And it's like, oh, but no, that can be such a superpower because you care about people and you're trying to bring more goodness to the world. You're trying to make sure that the little person is taken care of. That's a beautiful thing. And we can have that illuminating light that makes us go, oh, I'm good. There are good things about me. And so that's where I think, again, if we acknowledge that we all go through the world differently, and some of us go through the world differently because of things that have been put on us, both structurally and individually, right? And so how do we actually use the Enneagram in a way that will open that up and not just treat it like we all have the same interaction with it? We all get that moment of where we hated ourselves, so now we're studying the Enneagram. It doesn't have to be that way. And so I think that I just want that gentle, sweet light that can show us our full selves. And I think that that makes it something that is for all people, that more people will be drawn to if they see it, if that illumination comes in that gentle way.
Well, Micky, wow. We've covered a lot of territory, and everything we've covered has eons and depths of conversation that could go on. It strikes me that even though we only brought it up, you brought it up once, that there's a lot in what you're saying that is trauma informed, that there's an awareness, about the embedded trauma that individuals have and that intergenerational, collective trauma. So I think that's another big topic. And I want everyone to know that there is a special panel on this summit where we are addressing the Enneagram and trauma. And I also want everyone to know that fortunately we get to talk to Micky again, because she is on another session where she will be talking to one of the presidents of the IEA about some of the barriers to people of color and people of marginalized communities becoming accredited professionals in the Enneagram field. Micky, I'm over the moon. I'm baptized in the waters. I feel fortunate to be in your transmission and your field here. And I just want to thank you for your care, your truth, your awareness, and your lighting a fire under the Enneagram field. And you're wanting to create an Enneagram field where everybody is welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. And it has been delightful to be with you and to be with this community. And I just looking forward to how we're going to continue to grow together.